Hey, what's up? My name's Cameron and this is Design Based, a channel where I talk about everything design, and today's video is going to be some more tips and tricks. So last week's video was some do's and don'ts about layout and composition, so if you missed that, there'll be a link in the description, but we're going to keep that going, and this time we're going to do some more do's and don'ts, but this video is a top 5 do's and don'ts relating to typography. So this whole video is going to be focused on type and fonts and how you're working with them, adjusting them, and even which ones you're choosing. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first tip here is probably something you've heard about before and likely something you're doing, but it is definitely one of the most important tips and just something that you definitely need to get a grasp on if you're not doing it already, and this is kerning. So what is kerning? Well, kerning is the specific space between letter pairs. So if you're looking at the space between everything as a whole, that's called tracking, and you'll see here that if I change the tracking to 100, there'll be a big gap between everything. But kerning is the specific space between a pair of letters. So for example, you could kern between the A and the W here, the W and the E, and so on and so forth. But the point of kerning is generally to make the space look the same everywhere. So there are defaults, and if you make some new type, it will probably be on auto, but we'll see there's some issues there. You can change it to optical, and sometimes that'll help it. For things like headlines, this might work fine, but if you're doing big titles, large text for an ad or anything else, or especially if you're making a logo, you really want to fine adjust the kerning. So looking at this here, we can see that if you're not looking too close, they both look about the same, but the more you look into it, the worse the top one is and the more refined the bottom one is. So then how do you work this, and what's the difference here? So just to illustrate that a little more, if we look here at this example, I kind of put some lines here to show what the general space is. So you'll see that the space between the A and the W is huge, whereas things like the E and the S or the S and the O is quite tiny, but overall the issue is just that it's so inconsistent. So what I did is went ahead and refined it, fine-tuned it, and made it so they're all about the same space, and that's really what you're trying to do. So if we go back here without any of the things in the way, you'll just see that the bottom one feels refined and makes sense, but how do you fix this? If you've already expanded your type, you can simply hit the arrow keys and move them around, but if your type is live, you can actually click between the letters. So if I want to adjust this AW space, then I can hold Alt and hit the left arrow key to make it closer, or the right arrow key to make it further. And if you hold Control, it will scale it at a much larger rate. But also, one huge tip that I found out here is that the increment that it scales by when you press Alt and one of the arrows is probably too much off the bat. So you can go into your preferences, and if you go into your type preferences, you can find the one that says tracking, and here changing it to 5 from the default, which I believe is 20, is going to give you a lot more precision and just be a lot easier to fine tune using your keyboard. But overall, just looking out for the spacing and making sure it's consistent is going to be something huge in design, and especially if you're doing logos. I can't believe how many logos I see that aren't perfected, and it's just something you have to do if you're finalizing type, finalizing a mark, or just if you have big type that's going to be seen in details. So the next tip here is kind of similar and relates to spacing, but this is going to relate to line spacing, or leading as it's called. And the left example here is what you shouldn't do, but what a lot of people do, and closer to more of a default setup. So there are a few things we're going to go over here. First, you'll notice that the left, the text is quite tight, and while that's okay, generally the default spacing is going to be way too tight, and if you're doing something like a report or a book, this might be a different consideration, but for the general way designers use type and small blurbs, usually a bit more breathing room is going to be better. So as a super general rule, there's something called +2 leading. So this would mean that if your size of type is 10 points, then your leading should be at least 12, but you'll see that is still pretty close. So when there's limited type, I like to use a lot bigger of spacing. So you'll see this right one is around 9/16, and that's a lot bigger than +2, but it also just looks a lot cleaner, has a lot more space and room to breathe, and is just much more approachable and professional. So that's a big consideration with leading. It's generally going to be too low by default. You should make sure it's at least +2, which means that the second value should be at least 2 more than this size value here, but oftentimes that's not going to be enough, and you should make sure that it is quite breathable if you have the room for it. You probably don't want to go much above double the type size if ever, but something like 1.5 can be great. And with this, there's another tip, and that is simply that if you're making a break between paragraphs, you should not just hit a hard return or enter, but instead there's something called paragraph spacing. So if you scroll down in your paragraph panel, you can go here and you'll see space after paragraph. So if we set that to a value we want, say like 12, then we can remove the space, and every paragraph is going to have this space between it. Usually you're going to want that space to be just slightly smaller than a line of text, and it's just going to help them feel closer together, read more similarly, and just not leave random white gaps in the middle of your page. So that's big. And then one more tip off of this is when you're working with headlines, they should always be closer to the text that follows and the text they're the headline for than the text before it. So sometimes you'll have something like this, and you'll see here that the "so how should you align" is actually closer to the text before it, and that doesn't really work with the hierarchy. It gets a little confusing just because now it's more grouped to the stuff that it's not actually with. So you should fix that by making sure that the gap between a heading is smaller for the text after it and not just identical to what's before, and definitely not closer to what's before. So by giving it a little more breathing room, making sure that you don't have huge gaps between every paragraph, and keeping your headings closer to the text they're relevant to, your typography will work a ton better. However, when you're doing titles, this is kind of flipped. So the letting on titles is often going to be way too big by default. So here you'll see this is just the auto value for 40 point, it's 48, but when I'm using all caps especially, it's just so far apart and there's such a big gap. So coming down here, I actually have it so that the space with the letting is negative, and you'll pretty much never do that in body copy, but with huge text and especially caps in a title, it does make a lot more sense to have it closer for the same reason as space between paragraphs. We just don't want too much, and for these things they're linked, so we want it to read as one rather than almost two separate points. So that's just a little caveat, and a little thing that's a bit different you should watch out for is the spacing should probably be turned down when you're doing titles. The next tip here is a big one, especially if you're doing announcement graphics that I see on Twitter, or images that have a bit of text but aren't really text heavy. I see a lot of people make interesting font choices, and there are definitely some things you should watch out for here. So you'll see that this first example here uses a cool font for the headings, and that's fine, it looks great, but when it's used in a bit of a smaller body copy, it's quite hard to read and definitely a little more challenging than its counterpart, which you'll see in the good example. So what are some things you should watch out for, and what shouldn't you use? Well, if you know the text is going to be small in body, the more details there are, essentially the worse it's going to be. So here we can see all these thin serifs and kind of awkward spacing, more stylized letters. All of that looks great when it's larger, but the smaller it is, the more it's just going to muddle it and distract you when you're trying to read it. So you should make sure that any body copy is set in a super legible and readable typeface, and that's going to be important. So if you find a typeface you really like with a lot of personality, maybe you can use that for the titles or the headings, but then going into the body copy, you should go with something that is clean and super easy to read, because no matter what, the point of body text is to be read, and if you're making this harder for people, it's just going to be quite unnecessary, and it is going to hurt your design's usability and how much people like it. So then this next tip here is quite similar, but this is about font choice and specifically relating to the contrast and headings. So how should you choose fonts for your headings? Should they be the same? Should they be different? And what's actually wrong in this left example? Because this is one of the more detailed and a little harder to see at first glimpse tips. So this is that you should not use a font for the heading and body that are different, but not too different. So you'll see here the body copy is all quite squared off, there's a bit of variable width, but mostly quite geometrical. But then when we look at this, it's a little different. The O is less geometrical, a little more humanist, but the biggest difference here is just that all the corners are curved, and something like this C we don't really see in the other font, but when you put them together they just feel slightly off because they're quite similar but not different enough to really warrant using different fonts. So there are two solutions for this. Firstly, you can simply use the same font for your headings and for your body, and you'll just see that it looks so much cleaner and just way more perfected and professional and purposeful. So that's one way of doing it. But alternatively, let's say you actually want some contrast, want a different font, and like the last tip, maybe you want to bring some personality in. Well, a great way to do that is using one that's vastly different for the heading. So you'll see that this one really looks nothing like the body. They're both the same style in the most general sense, which is what we want. They're both kind of geometrical and quite simple and perfected, so they work together well. well, but they're quite a bit different. So because of that, we can use them side by side, and they look different enough that we have this good contrast and it seems purposeful. But a problem I often see people making, especially in things like brand guidelines posted on Behance and things like that, and you just see sometimes people will use fonts that are slightly different for everything from titles to headings to body, and it's really just gonna confuse it and get in the way when they could all just be the same and it would make a lot more sense. So that's something you should watch out for. Either just make it the same or make it different in high contrast if there's a good purpose, but don't just use two similar ones that aren't the same just for the sake of it. And then the next tip here deals with line length, and this is something I don't hear talked about too much, but it is quite important. Just because, like we've said before, type's main purpose is for reading, so the easier we can make reading, the better. And as humans, we do have certain things that are just psychological and in our brain and just the best ways to do things, and line length is one of these. So there is an optimal line length, and that's about 50 to 60 characters, which works out generally to about 10 to 12 words, but obviously characters are going to be more precise. And you'll just see here that this bottom example is doing just that. That's about 50 to 60 characters, whereas the top is just super long line lengths, and the bottom one's going to work a lot better for a variety of reasons, but mostly this is just the natural split, so people won't get lost on the line, it won't go on too long, and it's just highly easy to do and read. So how can you watch out for this, and how can you use line length? Well, there's a few ways. One, you can simply do what I've done here and just cut it down so the text box is the line length you want, and then there's going to be some negative space, but usually that's going to be fine for you. However, an alternative way would be to use columns, so I can make this into 2 columns of text if I needed it to fill this width or if I had more, or you can simply just make this text larger and then it'll fill out the area more on its own and have shorter line lengths anyway. But just making sure you're aiming for this 50 to 60 characters or around 10 to 12 words is the best for readability, and that's just from a human point of view, so you should always try to stay within this. And then the next tip here is another one that's a little technical, but is something I see a lot, and this is especially prominent within people making logos or using a logo that runs into a title. But really, when you're using 2 different fonts side by side, there are some considerations you have to make. So you'll see this top one just feels really off, and it's kind of hard to tell why, but there are some rules and things you should watch out for. So for this matching sizes, the most important thing is that you're matching the X height, because here you'll see that these are both virtually the same size. And it is something you have to watch out for, that if you use 2 typefaces, one might just be bigger by default, and sometimes just making it smaller will fix it. But for this, it's still awkward. And why is that? Well, it's because we don't have the X height matched. And what is the X height? Well, it's simply the height of a lowercase x. Pretty much any lowercase character, but an X is the one that will never extend above or below. So the height of this X should be matched in both fonts. So we'll see here if we bring up some guides that this is obviously not the case in this first one. So there's a couple ways to fix this. One, we could simply narrow it down and make the X height the same, and you'll see we do that with the second one. But why isn't it a check mark? It's because this still feels kind of awkward, and that's just because we're using so different ones. This second font has a huge X height that's really high, whereas this other one's more standard, but even if we make them the same, they just feel misaligned because we had to shrink the word based so much. So what's a better solution? Well, it's to find 2 contrasting fonts that'll just work better together. So we'll see these fonts are nowhere near identical, but they both have a similar X height off the bat. So we'll see that once we fine-tune it just a little bit more, it makes a lot more sense, and it really works together much better than this first one. So you can get away with this second technique, and if it's a much less drastic difference, it'll work quite great, but sometimes you do just need to actively think which 2 typefaces are going to work together, and a metric you should use to choose that is the X height, because when you match the sizes, everything will match a lot better, and matching the X height is the biggest thing you can do to make 2 typefaces in the same line work together well. So there we have it. Those are my top 5 do's and don'ts, my tips and tricks when working with typography, and this is just the best things you can keep in mind, some things that I definitely noticed some people don't quite have a grasp on, and just a lot of the best things I took away from university and my type courses there. So hopefully these helped you. If these did help you, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It will help me out a ton. Let me know what tips and tricks you'd like to see next time. Other than that, I hope you're having an awesome day and go design something great.